Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. This idea of finding the right balance between having a stable government and a dynamic private sector. And our main source for this deep dive is going to be George Yeo.
Oh, yeah.
He's a prominent Singaporean political figure, so we'll be kind of seeing things through his lens.
Right.
But I think you'll find that a lot of his insights go way beyond just Singapore. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think Yeo's perspective is particularly interesting, because he saw firsthand how Singapore managed to achieve such remarkable success.
Yeah, and a lot of people credit that success to that balance that we're going to be talking about today. So speaking of Yale, one of the things that really stuck with me was this really striking metaphor that he uses to describe the role of government. He compares it to a banyan tree.
Yes, the banyan tree. It's known for being so stable, it's got deep roots and provides shade and shelter. Yeo even takes it a step further and compares it to a bonsai tree. The ones that need just the right amount of care and pruning.
Right. Yeah, that's a really powerful analogy. I think what resonates with me the most is that idea that governments are kind of like the framework. They provide like the essential foundation that societies need to actually function.
Yeah.
But then there's this constant question
Yeah.
of how much should the government actually do?
Right.
How much should they prune or guide things versus stepping back and just letting them grow organically? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Yeo would say that it's a very delicate balance to strike. If you have too much control from the government, that can actually stifle innovation, and it can stifle individual initiative, especially in the private sector. But if you have too little guidance, then you risk chaos and instability. So he really emphasizes that you need to have that government continuity, because governments can provide that long-term perspective that you might not get otherwise. It's like tending to that bonsai tree. You need to have a steady hand over time.
That makes me think about how businesses operate.
Yeah.
They need a stable environment to be able to plan and invest so that they can grow. But then on the other side of that coin, you have the private sector, which is all about dynamism.
Right.
And actually, Yeo contrasts that with the banyan tree.
Exactly. He sees the private sector as that force for vibrancy. It's constantly adapting and innovating to meet the demands of whatever the market needs. And that's where you see entrepreneurial spirit. That's where you see the drive to push boundaries and create something new.
Right. And that's where things get really interesting because on the one hand, we all benefit from the innovation and the efficiency of the private sector. But what happens when that dynamism turns into like excessive competition? Yale seems to have some pretty strong opinions about that.
Absolutely. He definitely points out the downsides of having a hyper-competitive environment. He has this really striking phrase to describe it. He says that in the past, big eats small, but in the future, fast eats slow.
Wow. That's a really powerful way to put it. And I think it speaks to something that a lot of people are feeling today, this constant pressure to keep up and adapt and innovate, but at like lightning speed. It can be really exhilarating, but it's also incredibly exhausting.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what Yeo is getting at. This relentless pace can really take a toll on people. It can create so much anxiety. You're always on edge. You never feel like you're doing enough.
Right. And that discomfort, that feeling of just being overwhelmed can lead people to want to make big changes in their lives, whether that's in their careers or even in the entire system that they live in.
Exactly. When the environment is too volatile or unpredictable, people naturally want stability. They want to feel secure. They want continuity. And that's where Yeo sees the role of government becoming even more important.
So it's like a pendulum that's swinging back and forth. Too much dynamism and competition makes people crave stability. But then too much stability can stifle innovation and make people want more dynamism.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. The challenge for individuals and for societies is to find that sweet spot, that dynamic equilibrium, where stability and dynamism can coexist and actually reinforce each other.
So where does Singapore fit into all of this? With its history of strong government and a thriving private sector, Yeo makes some interesting comparisons to other Asian economies.
He does. He talks about how Singapore really relied on attracting these multinational corporations, or MNCs, to drive its economic growth.
Okay, so focusing on these big players.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to nurture these smaller local businesses.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with places like Taiwan and Hong Kong. where they had more of an emphasis on fostering homegrown small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs.
Okay, so different approaches lead to different outcomes. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, Yeo points out that while relying on MNCs can lead to rapid economic growth, it also creates a very specific type of ecosystem, one that might not be as good for entrepreneurial ventures trying to grow organically.
That's really interesting. So it highlights how different development paths can shape a nation's economic and entrepreneurial landscape. It's something to think about when you're looking at your own business environment. Does it favor these big established companies? Or does it allow room for these new startups?
Yeah. It also raises questions about the long-term impacts of those different approaches. Does relying on MNCs create dependency? Does it limit the potential for innovation coming from within? These are the kinds of questions that Yeo wants us to think about.
So it's not just about achieving economic growth. It's about creating an economic ecosystem that is both sustainable and resilient.
Exactly. And that's where Yeo thinks the government plays such a critical role, creating the conditions where you can have both stability and dynamism.
Okay. So we've talked about this interplay between government stability, the banyan tree, and this dynamic energy of the private sector. But how do we as individuals actually navigate all of this? How do we thrive in an environment that constantly demands that we adapt and evolve? Yeo talks about a pretty intriguing concept to address this.
He does. He introduces this idea of social instincts.
Instincts.
Yeah, almost like these innate behaviors that help groups survive and succeed.
Okay, tell me more about this.
Well, he argues that as the world gets more complex and competitive, certain social instincts become even more important for individuals and societies to thrive.
Like what?
So specifically, he talks about adaptability, empathy, and a sense of loyalty to the group.
Those sound pretty important, especially if you're trying to navigate a world that's constantly changing and feels so competitive.
Exactly. And Yeo believes that these instincts are essential for any group, whether it's a team, a community, or an entire nation, to be able to pass what he calls the Darwinian test.
The Darwinian test.
Yes.
You've really piqued my curiosity. What does that mean?
Essentially, he's saying that in a world where fast eats slow, groups that are able to adapt, empathize, and stick together are more likely to survive and succeed.
So it's not enough to be individually strong or brilliant. You need to have a collective ability to navigate challenges.
Yeah.
And actually support each other.
Thanks.
I'm starting to see where this is going. But before we dive into this idea of the Darwinian test, I think we need to take a quick break. We'll be back with part 2 after this.
This idea of a Darwinian test, it might sound a bit harsh at first, but I think what Yeo is trying to do is really emphasize how important these social instincts are, especially as the world keeps changing so rapidly. It's not about this dog-eat-dog mentality. It's about groups needing to evolve and adapt together if they want to thrive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not about crushing the competition. It's more about, cultivating those qualities that help you get through the tough times. And I think this is where Yeo's military experience comes in. He has this really powerful analogy about having to carry stretchers during combat.
Yes, it's such a great example of how these instincts play out when the stakes are high. He talks about how it's not just about individual strength. It's about the group's ability to support each other. The strong ones help carry the weak ones. Because at some point, we're all vulnerable.
Right. That analogy really stuck with me, too. It makes you think about competition in a whole new way. It's about interdependence. Yeah. You're only as strong as your weakest link.
Exactly.
And if you can recognize that, that might be the key to success for the whole group.
Exactly. And Yeo argues that these social instincts, they aren't just nice to have. They're absolutely essential for survival, especially as the world changes faster and faster.
So how do we actually cultivate these instincts? Are we born with them? Or can we learn them and get better at them?
That's a great question. I think Yeo would say that it's a bit of both. We might have certain predispositions, but these instincts can also be nurtured and developed, through our experiences, education, and by consciously making an effort.
So it's not enough to just be a tough individual.
Yeah.
You need to create a culture of collaboration and empathy within the group.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the role of government, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeo believes that governments have a responsibility to help foster these social instincts. They can do that through policies that promote things like education and social cohesion, and even a sense of shared purpose.
So if a government focuses too much on cutthroat competition, it might actually end up undermining those really essential social instincts.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about finding that balance again, creating an environment where people feel supported and feel connected to something bigger than themselves.
It's all starting to make sense now. So the government provides the foundation, The private sector brings the dynamism and the innovation. And then these social instincts are what help us navigate through all the complexity.
Yeah, you got it. And that brings us to another really important point that Yeo makes, the need for a moral framework to guide all of our actions.
A moral framework.
Yeah.
So it's more than just laws and regulations.
Right. He's talking about values principles, maybe even a shared sense of purpose. That can help us when we're in those gray areas, where just focusing on efficiency and competition might lead us down the wrong path.
So it's like having a compass. That helps you figure out what to do in those tough situations, where there's no easy right or wrong answer.
Exactly. It's so easy to get caught up in the metrics and the bottom line that we forget about the big picture.
Right. Even if you have a system that's super efficient, you still need to figure out what's actually worth optimizing for.
Exactly. And this is where individual responsibility becomes so important. Yeo makes it clear that each person needs to define their own moral compass. It's about reflecting on your values and thinking about the impact your actions have, and then trying to do what you think is right, even when it's hard.
It's like Yeo's giving us all this great information about the systems we're a part of. But he's also telling us, don't forget to look inward.
Exactly. We aren't just passive players in these systems. We have the ability to shape them and to shape ourselves in a way that lines up with our values.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We're looking at this interplay between stability, dynamism, and the human element. And it gives you a whole new perspective on the challenges and opportunities that we face.
It really does. And I think the biggest takeaway for our listeners is this. We all play a role in building the kind of society that we want to live in. It doesn't matter if it's through our choices as consumers or our actions as citizens or how we lead in our communities and our workplaces. We can make a difference.
That's a great way to put it. So to everyone listening out there, keep thinking about these ideas, keep asking questions, and keep working towards a world where stability and dynamism can work together, where competition and compassion can thrive. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.